dearest viewers. I am Finn Bell, poet from the San Francisco Bay Area, and your host of the Poets Lighthouse. In our virtual studio today is writer and poet Samuel Lee. Samuel works across literary studies, art history, and visual culture. His debut collection, A Field Guide to Supermarkets in Singapore, was the winner of the 2018 Singapore Literature Prize for Poetry in English. His work has appeared in the Yale Literary Magazine, A Luxury We Cannot Afford, On Free Verse, and 11 by 9, collaborative poetry from the Philippines and Singapore. He has studied at the National University of Singapore, Yale University, and the University of Chicago, and is interested in 19th century art and visuality, histories of collecting in Southeast Asia, and writing about contemporary art. He currently lives in Singapore. Welcome to our show, Samuel.
Thank you, Finn. Thanks for the introduction.
You're so very welcome. So, Samuel, in your bio, you indicated that aside from literary studies, you also work in art history and visual culture. Do you find that these instructions readily inform one another? Or are there cases where they are best kept separate and undiluted?
I would have to say that they remain quite discreet, I would say, but they are. But I find there are moments when they cross-pollinate with each other. So my interest in art history really stems from, I think, a broader interest in historical narratives and the kind of satisfaction I get with working in archives and looking and thinking about the past. So that's like a very art historian brain. I think the poetic form allows for a kind of a looseness of associations that a historical frame of mind does not permit. For example, you cannot invent or speculate, or rather, like, it's generally considered bad form if you invent or speculate certain gaps about the past. If you're writing like a research paper, although it depends on the situation and context, of course. But I think in terms of poetry, it offers me like a creative freedom to think about how different elements might come together or inform each other, especially if they did not share a common. There is no sufficient evidence to show that they are connected. But I'm talking the abstract. Maybe as we go by, I might think of examples. The other thing I realize is that it's quite interesting that many art historians like also write poetry or they have published poetry. So it's a two parallel worlds that they inhabit almost.
Well, why do you think this is so? Is it a chronicling of sorts in two different forms? Do you believe?
I think it could be that as one pours through some areas of historical research, for example, looking at archives of from a certain time or from a certain artist, and finding moments in which there is a kind of poetic feeling when one goes through correspondence or when one looks at an archival photograph, that does not necessarily make its way into the final research paper, and I think poetry allows for that communication that like me as the researcher or the person who was given the privilege of entering an archive, which is usually the exclusive domain of people from a certain field. there is there is a sense of wanting to bring something out into the world from this secured body of evidence and body of historical preservation or and yeah, I think that poetry allows for that communication to that subjectivity of the subjectivity of the researcher who observes and goes through the material. But I also feel that maybe it's not the case. Maybe it's that they just that poets who are art historians, maybe they also are interested in narrating the self or thinking about. I mean, maybe their poetry isn't always about art, also, but I find that not to be the case. I think it's also because as poets, we tend to think quite imagistically. For example, when I'm working on poems, I would think of an image and almost ekphrastically I would describe it, and it's the act of description that allows me to think about what makes it a poem, or what makes it interesting for the reader, or what makes it count as an instance of a poetic articulation.
And because it's based on image, usually an ekphrastic. So given that they are image based, do you believe that the fact that they are imperfect, does that lend to the to the richness of it, not having the full picture as as it is given to us, like there are some gaps that we fill in with our own imagination?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that the image, like the poem, is also it's full of gaps and areas of where things are suggested rather than delivered wholesale to the person who apprehends it. I'm thinking about how people in for example, the Middle Ages or the Renaissance would look at a panel painting of, for example, the life of a saint, and be able to conjure a narrative within a single within single frame, and that to me is an instance of how poetry might operate as well, by the sheer degree of compression that's involved in the poem as opposed to a novel. That we are able to identify certain elements, maybe it's a motif or maybe it's an image that might be a spring of associations to the viewer or to the reader, and that's kind of how I approach the idea of a poem. It's similar to a sense of approaching like a narrative painting almost.
That makes sense. That absolutely
Yeah.
makes sense. Thank you for that. So when we return from our break, folks, we will learn more about our wonderful guest, Samuel Lee. Thank you for returning from the break with us. We are talking today with Singapore-based poet and writer Samuel Lee. Samuel, Tonight, you have brought for us to read from your award winning debut collection, A Field Guide to Supermarkets in Singapore, a poem titled On Winning the Award for Most Outstanding Shopper. Would you please be so kind to share your poem and tell us a little bit more about it?
I'll read the poem from my first collection, A Field Guide to Supermarkets in Singapore. This poem is called On Winning the Award for Most Outstanding Shopper. On winning the award for Most Outstanding Shopper, I am congratulated on all sides by heads of lettuce, because to get to the biscuits and the noodles, you have to squeeze past the vegetables, and being new to the country, they are generous with their admiration and have spread their leaves forward as if to embrace. I may have fainted en route, but if upon waking it's the same song that's playing, and it's Minnie Riperton whistling maternally to her daughter, then I can believe again that the world is contiguous, and that the entire mall is celebrating something small and lonely, like a baby or a feral hamster. I want to ask if these memories are mine, or merely the reflection of electric lights against the storefront, the glow of a hall of mirrors, crafted accidentally from a shiny pleather boot and a hand mirror. Once I gave a thank you card to a salesman with a limp. Once I held open a door to a stranger while having a nosebleed. Once I ate a whole cheeseburger, each remaining sesame seed. Once I hailed a cab and gave it to a child in need. Once I picked up a bottle of shampoo that fell on the floor and restored it to its best position. Brilliantly, the light shines upon the freshly mopped floor and rewards even the children with tiny coins.
Objects and imagery in there. So, in this poem, I feel like there's a sense that the narrator is in turn being in reality and then in a slightly surreal um, mode and inhabiting for a moment the experience of these objects, if you know, if you could call it that, that are in the market themselves. I feel that it's at once, from my perspective, observing something familiar and foreign at the same time, alternatingly. Who would this narrator represent while they're doing this?
Yeah, thank you for your observations. I think, yeah, you've like I think described it in a way that I I've been thinking about when I was writing the poem,
Mhm.
in terms of the surreal environment that the the speaker is caught up in.
Mhm.
Um, Sorry, could you repeat the last part of your question again, so I can address it a bit more directly?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I because I felt that at times the narrator themselves were inhabiting the different objects. Like when you spoke about the head of lettuce at the beginning, and then the object that they were sort of mirrored in, the coins at the end. I felt that those could be representative of, you know, the narrator or somebody observing. So they became the narrators themselves. These objects became characters. Who would these narrators represent?
Yeah, I think I wanted uh, to think about how objects kind of have almost a life of their own, or to think about, uh, I mean, something like the agency of the object and how they ended up from different parts of the globe into this same space. And I also want to think about the shrill quality of being in a supermarket, because
Mhm.
everything is jostling for your attention. And I mean, it's also the product of the labor of so many people
Yes.
that an object finds its way into this space. And it's also about the feel the quality of the field of vision that you have in the supermarket with the geometric aisles and especially if you go to like a big box supermarket, the aisles kind of like diverge or converge into a vanishing point because
Yes.
they are like parallel lines, and you're like, where's the detergent? So I was thinking about all of that when I was writing this poem, and I was also thinking about the kind of like the odd language that I find in a Singaporean context. Like you have to win awards for things, or like there's so many awards for things, and people are always wanting to be like the need to be ranked in order to feel celebrated. Which I find a bit like idiosyncratic to Singapore, but I'm not sure about how it's like elsewhere. So I just wanted to kind of like poke fun at this mode of being with the title. I mean, like most outstanding shopper. Like there's a whole thing, like there's a whole like mini discourse now about how some people have like a protagonist complex, or like you have a main character complex, like main character syndrome, like
Yes.
you always feel like you need to be like you are the main character, and like to some degree, I mean that's just the product of living in the world in like the first person. So but at the same time I wanted to like play with that idea, because it also implies that the world that you inhabit with the objects around you kind of make you disappear as the protagonist into this like atmosphere, or I would say atmosphere of objects which we think to be non-sentient, but I mean like it's like an idea that I've been grappling with for years.
But I honestly, absolutely am there with you as far as, you saying about this current leaning towards people trying to find, themselves being this main character in their life, or this main character in different scenarios. I noticed that in different types of media. I was going to actually ask you, so you mentioned supermarkets. Do you think, and this is going to be a really weird question, the fact of how lively an open air market is in any place in the world, but what I recall in Southeast Asia, it's particularly lively. Even the objects, the scenario has a life to it that's not present in a boxed or a big box supermarket. Do you think that there is a different take on the personification of these objects? Should they be displaced and put into the realm of an open air market, say, for example?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think no one has like asked me about this. Like there's a clear difference between the wet market or the farmers market and the supermarket. And I think it's important. Yeah, like I feel that this focalizes the idea of the supermarket even further, because the supermarket is the place where things are always contained, and the logic is of containment and a kind of organization. And actually, that I would say that need to organize is also a question. It's a visual question, because things have to be orderly in order to be desirable. And in terms of like the traditional marketplace, I would say that things there's like a chaos on the surface, but there's also like an order or a structure beneath it
Mm-hmm.
in terms of what you can do and what you cannot do, and what is socially acceptable at the market, how you should comport yourself when you're haggling, uh, personalities of stall owners, like micro histories that they come with,
Mm-hmm.
all those things, which invite a kind of a need to negotiate with space and with things,
Yes.
but which also like opens up your senses and makes you pay attention to things around you. Which is why I felt maybe I couldn't really write a poem about like a marketplace, because like it's already given to you. Like there is like maybe going to a market, an open air market, like
Mm-hmm.
is like a poetic experience in itself, and doesn't need the text or the textual shell to
Yeah, no, I would have to
present
say
it
that. I would have to
as
say
a
that
thing.
too. I'm when you said about it being its own poetic experience, absolutely, absolutely. That just the engagement of everything, your senses, and then some. When you do
Hmm.
enter the open air marketplace, you referred to as a wet market, I believe. I
Yeah,
love that. I love that idea. Yes, no, it's an absolutely shock at first when you do enter
it
one, and
is.
then
Yeah,
you
yeah,
do you're able to actually find order in the chaos. You're able to find the music, for lack of a better term, the music
yeah, exactly.
that's woven into all the activity and the bustle that's going
Yeah,
on.
yeah. And there's a clear
Yes,
rhythm to it as well. Like you have
yes,
to enter at a certain time of the day.
yes,
If you go too late, you'll find yourself like just picking the like what everyone has rejected.
yes.
So I think it's like there's also a sense of occasion, like going to the market like in the morning with
Hmm.
your bags, uh, that you don't really get at the supermarket. Like you don't. Uh, there is no like sense of there's no palpable sense of excitement.
Yes.
And you also mentioned shock, and it's true that like entering a wet market or farmers market, it's like, especially in a place like Southeast Asia, like there's a shock
Hmm.
when when like the smells assault you, and it's very strong,
Yes.
especially if like there's meat involved and like seafood. There's like pleasurable smells
Hmm.
and displeasurable ones that I think the supermarket like strives to eliminate,
Yes.
which is why I found the supermarket such a strange space of exclusion and containment. Like
Yes.
you want to make sure that the experience is
And there's this sense
yeah.
of when you think of supermarkets, you think routine. When you think of, and especially in the more traditional sense of when the way that families used to um, organize going to the wet market, it becomes an event versus routine. Routine is like, something that they do, they're able to fit it in easily into their week several times a week.
Mhm.
I remember traditionally going to an outdoor market. It would involve, the coordination of the whole families, maybe done every once a
Mhm.
month, every twice a month, especially for people who, live outside of the core of town. That certainly was my experience with my family. We lived on the outer countryside. So we would go in every once or twice a month, and then we would have to just make an event of it, bring all the bags, carry, have all the family come, because we would have to have a big haul going home, because it's not going to happen again. So it becomes an event, it becomes an experience more so than the routine of going to the market.
Yes, yes, yeah, absolutely.
So we are nearing our time. I wanted to ask
Okay.
you two more questions that I was really curious about. I understand that you have upcoming um, projects happening. Two of which you had mentioned previously. One of them was putting together a collection of poems that were based on your grandparents traversing from the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya during the time, or during or after the time of World War II. And then the other thing you mentioned, which was really exciting to me because you mentioned a name that I'm excited about, was a project involving Billy Collins. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Okay. I can talk about the second thing first because I think
Absolutely.
the first item would take a bit more time. So I think that I'm very excited about the second project, which is more of like an interview with Billy Collins as part of the Singapore Writers Festival this year. And so I've been like rereading his past collections and actually finding that like new things all the time when I read them. And there is like there's a certain warmth with which Billy Collins regards his reader, and it's like a delight to read, and I am quite excited to speak to him about that. The first thing that you mentioned about working in a series of poems about my grandparents at this like at the in the first half of the 20th century. I just thought about it, and I've been trying to draft some like a series of poems about that, and it's challenging for me because I've never written about like family histories poetically or otherwise, because it's something that's so common, like it's something that's commonplace and like re-narrated within a family, but when you have to articulate it to make it like legible to a certain audience, I have to use words that that are like shorthand for a certain expectation. So I think this was the first time I've said they traversed between the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya, because like if I were to be talking about to my family about this, I would never like be like, yeah, they went between the British Empire and like the Dutch Empire, like as a kind of colonial and post-colonial experience. Like you would never say that. But like I think like I have to do a bit of reframing, and I'm still trying to grapple with like how truthful or untruthful that is. It's truthful in that it frames them as something as people who are part of a larger historical experience, a collective historical experience, but at the same time, like it feels untruthful because they have never articulated that in those terms. Instead, it was something like, oh, you know, when your grandmother still lived in like Anambas, which is now like the part of the Riau archipelago in Indonesia. The like, you know, and then how, you know, maybe my grandfather was like in Penang or something, but they would never like connect that to larger systems of power that we can do, a kind of like connection that we can make today. So I just find it very interesting, like there's a moment where you feel like very dissociated from the experience, but at the same time you're trying to connect that specific and particular experience
and
with.
so this is where this is what you mentioned a while ago about the expectations. Is this where the expectations are coming from? Are they partially from you or from other family members? Is there concern about, you know, the very distinct possibility of having, you know, a faulty or unreliable narrator? Obviously, you know, not everybody can recall what's happened, and some of it was obviously passed down from from generation to generation.
Yeah, I would say my grandparents are not around anymore, but even when my grandpa was around and would tell stories, he was also a pretty unreliable narrator because his stories would change and sometimes become embellished.
I
But that's
see.
the nature of like
Yes.
oral tradition.
That
There
that
is
is
like
that is the joy
yeah,
there. It becomes more of a legend,
yeah,
a
yeah.
family
It's actually
legend.
more interesting that way.
Yes,
Like you,
exactly.
yeah, like it's truthful, but it's not factual. Like
Yes,
that's how it is.
yes.
Mm,
Very much like, oh my goodness, I'm trying to remember the movie Big Fish. I don't know if you ever
uh,
saw that movie where,
no, I've
um,
not. But
yes, every time his father or both of his parents would, relay they would retell the same story. It became more and more fantastical. I
oh
think
yeah.
that's where they got the title from because this fish that was once maybe like, um, you know, a handful or two hands worth became like 6 feet tall. It became very wildly embellished, but all the more interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. It's that. I mean, it's what you want to remember as well,
Yes,
and like it's truthful because you're like true to like the sense of or the feeling or affect that you had when you are remembering it. Uh, but maybe it's not. Maybe it wasn't like a. Maybe it wasn't a blue dress, it was a green dress, or like tiny things like that.
yes, yeah,
Yeah. Mm. You mentioned you asked about expectations, whether they were from myself or
yes,
my family.
yes.
So I think it's a simple answer. I haven't told my family that I'm doing this project yet, so it's mainly
Ah,
expectations on myself.
okay.
Yeah, yeah. Mm. But I just found it very interesting that I've lived with their stories of migration of my grandmother's migration from from Riau to Singapore,
Hmm.
and connecting that uh, with with current historical discourses on on what does it mean to be Southeast Asian, like
Yes,
especially in Singapore, which has always thought of itself as a very specific and special island in the middle of the region. There was growing up, I never had a sense that we were connected, which is crazy because
huh.
we are like surrounded by islands, and the way that people move between locations in the past was by sea mainly, and my grandmother and grandfather would like always be on a ferry or something like that, going between islands, which was so natural to them. But I think when I was listening to your stories, I had no embodied sense of what that means.
I see. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So it's about uh so working on the project, I've been thinking about like the process of unlearning the geopolitics or the or what some people have called the geopoetics of being here, and how to uh, sort of relearn your sense of connection with the larger geopolitical or geopoetic entity.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, you know what? Any of the apprehension or the expectations. Obviously, truth truly matters. But I think more so the fact of laying it down on paper and having it there for future generations to hear or to see. Not only, obviously, most importantly, your family. So it's there, this history carried on, but for other people to experience, which would something that would otherwise have been, they would have been disconnected from, and they wouldn't have, they would have learned in a more sanitary textbook type way. This is more personal, and in my opinion, more truthful. So thank you so much, Samuel, for joining us today. I have one last wonderful,
Mhm.
juicy, exciting question for you. um, A little bit of fun. I don't know if I've done this with anybody else here in the Poets Lighthouse, but I have definitely asked other poets this. And I thought it would
Okay.
be like it's a fun icebreaker, but it's coming at the end. So, my last question for you is a poet, an artist from any discipline or any era in history are sitting with you, poet and writer Samuel Lee, for afternoon tea. Who are these two creatives? And what would you three be discussing?
Oh no, that's a very exciting question. I mean, um, it's weird, but like the first artist that came to my mind was actually the German Renaissance master engraver Albrecht Dürer. I think it's only because I'm reading a book about him, and uh, he he had like I'm reading a book about uh, how his engravings and how his works tend to be exercises in self consolation.
Mm.
So like that's been on my mind for a bit. Is art is making art, writing about art, writing poetry, also an act of self consolation, as if there were some kind of not an imbalance, but a kind of like like an irritation, like not in a negative sense, but like something that prompts you or compels you to have to deal or confront or work through it in the form of externalizing it as a mode of working through our self consolation. So that has been on my mind for a bit. So yes, I'd like to have tea with Albrecht Dürer, and the other person that the other writer I have been reading is actually, let's see, I've been reading a lot of people. Actually, Hannah Arendt.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's also because I've been reading Arendt for a bit, and like when I lived in Chicago for a while, I read that she lived in my neighborhood, and I always wondered about how she experienced the same streets that I would walk every day, but at the same time have all these like amazing and brilliant thoughts and ideas about politics and history that like I don't have. So like that I thought that was like quite amazing, like to share briefly the same space with an important thinker. So I'd like to have tea with her. I think she would be very tired of me, but I think I just want to be able to like tell people about like what she wore and what she said.
I think it would be a fantastic conversation. And I think that just trying to imagine the interaction between Arendt and Durer would be just something worth, having happen. Should we be able to, to make that happen? It would be phenomenal.
Yeah,
Yes. Thank you so much, Samuel, for taking this time out of your day to sit with us. We want to encourage our wonderful viewers to please check out Samuel's book. It is a field guide to supermarkets in Singapore. This is available through his website, which is www.samuellee.space. That is all one word, his name, Samuel Lee, and as well as finding out more about the Singapore Writers Festival, which he is a part of, by going to www.singaporewritersfestival.com. We want to thank our dear viewers and, of course, our wonderful guest for being here. And we would love for you to continue to support us by please watching all of our PGN programming and subscribing to our YouTube channel and liking and commenting on our videos. Please have a grand night. Thank you.
thank you so much for the invitation,
You're
Finn.
welcome.